Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Curling through the middle of Suffolk is a long and winding river. It starts at its source as a slim and peaceful thing, known as the River Gipping, overhung by willows and soft forests, before gradually swelling and broadening as it passes through the county until, by the time it reaches the coast at Ipswich, it has become a wide estuary known as the River Orwell, where mortals have traded and fished for many centuries. Once, a very long time ago, there lived on its banks a young fisherman who spent his days out on the herring boats, braving howling weather, rough seas, and all the hardship of the work, but dreaming of a different life. Every day he would see the smart barges which had sailed up from London on the Thames to gather produce from rural Suffolk before returning to the capital to sell it. That tantalising hint of the distant city filled him with longing for adventures, so close and yet so far beyond his reach. For although he daily asked the barges if there were posts open for a sailor such as he, so far he had had no luck. And so he spent his time on the herring boats, as far from his crewmates as he could manage, his eye wandering out over the sea, longing for a chance to look out on a new horizon. But he was not the only one, wishing for something just beyond his grasp. The mermaids of the North Sea knew to keep away from the boats. Their hungry nets took much from the water and gave nothing in return. The boats belonged to the mortals, and her parents had told her never to stray too close to them, lest she too be ripped from the water to feed their savage appetites, that she was to keep herself below water at all times so that they could not see her, so they couldn't cast out their nets to trap her instead of the herring. But the young mermaid also dreamt of a different world, a world above the water. One day, finding the lure of the glittering sun above too enticing, she flung herself above the surface, resting on a rock to let it warm her bones just for a second. Noticing the boat too late, seeing the man on the bow. In panic she dived again, but he had not seen her, staring out at the distant horizon with a melancholy expression. He was fair of face and strong of body, singing quietly to himself. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and more than that, something in his eyes, that wistful longing, spoke to her. But then the boat retreated down the river to the mortals' settlement, where she had been warned never to go, and she was left alone once more. All that day she thought of him, finding the next morning that she was drawn back to the same spot in case he had returned, drifting carefully beneath the hull, snatching glimpses of his face through the rippling water, listening to his rich voice softly singing to the sea. The young mermaid waited eagerly at the river mouth every morning for the boat and the fair sailor, spending her days as close as she dared, risking the nets for the chance to look upon him, watching in an agony of conflict each night as the boat retreated up the Orwell, so close and yet so far, wishing that one day he would look upon her with as much joy as she looked upon him. Finally, it became too much to bear, and the mermaid knew that she must follow him, just to see where he went, wanting to see this other world above the water in which he dwelled. So, weaving through the unfamiliar waters, dodging the clinging river reeds, she followed it, her heart pounding, as the light grew darker and darker, and she got further and further from the sea. Eventually, they reached a mortal town and the boat docked. She hid in the reeds, bewildered by the strange noises of the mortal world above. Too scared to peep her head up and fearing the return in unfamiliar waters in the dark, she huddled beneath the boat until sunrise. She did not know that her sailor was only just above her in the inn, that he was gritting his teeth in irritation as his fellows laughed at him. For he had just told them that he kept getting the strangest sensation when out on the water, that someone was watching him. But the seed he planted in their minds took root, and they all found themselves a little less certain when out on the sea the next day, noticing shapes in the water that they had not before, shadows that moved in a way that confused them, almost like a large creature was keeping pace with the boat. The mermaid's heart ached with longing, as for a whole season she trailed the fair sailor up and down the river, knowing he was just beyond her grasp, fearing his reaction should he ever see her, wishing with all her heart to know what it would feel like to see him look into her eyes and smile, just once, wishing to see as much joy in his face at the sight of her as she felt at the sight of him. One day she could bear it no longer. The fisherman, lost in his song, found his voice stilling as a woman's voice joined his, her tones sweet as sunlight on the sea, unsensuous as siren song. Her head rose up from the water, blinking up at him, her grey-green hair billowing out around her in the water, looking up at him with such love in her eyes as she sang his lullaby back to him, her silvery tail curling above the water behind her. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and his eyes widened, smiling in wonder and delight. The mermaid's heart was full to bursting, and before she knew what she was doing, she found herself smiling back, her needle-sharp fangs glinting in the morning sun. He threw himself back from the guardrail with a cry of horror, remembering all the stories he had been told as his Nan had dandled him on her knee, of the sea maids who seduced men into the water to drag them to the deeps, feasting on their flesh before they were even fully drowned. He bolted to the cabin and slammed the door shut. The mermaid didn't understand. At first he had seemed so pleased to see her. The look in his eyes had been all that she had hoped for. Confused and worried, she followed the boat back up the river, hoping for another chance. But none came. Heart aching, she followed the boat for the next few days, but she couldn't see him anywhere, couldn't hear his singing. One day, as she drifted under the boat while it was docked at the quay, she saw a figure on the bow once more, staring into the water. She approached eagerly, but stopped when she saw it was not him. It was another young man, a boy, truthfully, being joined by another, older figure. "You want to be careful, my lad," she heard the elder say. "You stare too much at the water, and she shows you strange things, twists your thoughts against you until you see monsters. The last lad did swear one day he saw a mermaid with fangs like razors, went rushing off the boat that night to swear he'd never set foot upon the water again, that he was going far inland where he never had to look at the sea for the rest of his mortal days." The mermaid felt her heart break on hearing those words. She drifted mournfully among the reeds in the shadow of the harbour, longing for the world above and the man now so far from her sight, unable to return to the sea, for what was left for her in the world she had known. Now she was pining for one she would not, could not ever know. The townsfolk shivered as, in the dark nights, they would hear a woman's voice singing, a beautiful melody, singing of love and longing, with such sorrow that their hearts ached to hear it, and they wished that it would stop. The winter that year was long and cruel, the river freezing solid, the ice shattering, as savage storms screamed up the Orwell from the North Sea like the wrath of a dying leviathan. One night, 2 men struggled through the weather to the warmth and safety of the inn. On their way, they were surprised to find their dogs going wild, bolting away into the dark. Cursing them for idiot mutts, they followed them down to the water's edge, finding them huddled around a pale shape on the icy shingle. It was the body of a woman. Grey-green hair tangled about her, her belly sloping down into the long tail of a fish, her beautiful face shadowed with heartache, tears still frozen on her cheeks under her open, glassy eyes. The men knew not what to do, were cold and frightened, and knowing they were seeing something that they should not ever have seen. In desperation, they picked her body up and flung it back into the water, seizing the dogs and rushing to the inn as fast as they could, skidding and slipping on the snow, desperate to wash the memory away with drink. They said nothing, but soon other voices began to whisper of a creature in the river, of an endless song in the dark, of how, if you stared into the water on a moonless night, you would see a pale face staring back, almost like you were looking on the ghost of a mermaid. Sweet dreams, my love.